The air was thick with smoke on May 29, 1453. Constantinople, jewel of Christendom, had fallen. Ottoman banners unfurled above the shattered walls, and the last cries of its defenders were drowned by the clash of steel and the thunder of drums. Amidst the chaos, there was one silent march of captives. Noblewomen, daughters and wives of emperors, generals, and aristocrats, led in chains through the ruined streets. For centuries, history has spoken of the cannons that breached the Theodosian walls, of the armies that stormed the city, and of the death of the final emperor. But it has remained eerily silent about what happened to the women of noble blood who lived in those palaces, cloisters, and high towers. Their fates were not etched in marble or chronicled in detail, for they carried a weight so taboo, so scandalous, that even the conquerors themselves preferred to keep them hidden behind veils of secrecy. The Byzantine princesses, Venetian brides, and Greek noble daughters, symbols of dynasties and honor, were suddenly reduced to spoils of war. To the Ottomans, they were more than captives. They were trophies, proof that entire empires had been subdued not just on the battlefield, but in the bedchamber. In an age where power was as much about bloodlines as it was about armies, possessing a noblewoman meant erasing her past and rewriting the future. One Venetian observer wrote that the Sultan's men dragged women from their chambers, like lambs torn from the altar. Some were forced into marriages with Ottoman officers. Others disappeared into the labyrinth of the imperial harem, where the walls echoed with whispers, but never allowed a scream to escape. And yet, within those walls, destinies shifted. What began as captivity could transform into immense influence. If one survived the ruthless hierarchy of intrigue and desire, but survival was no guarantee. Resistance often meant death. Submission meant erasure of identity. Conversion to Islam, renaming and reshaping of one's very existence was the price of living. The fate of noblewomen after Ottoman conquest was not just about chains and silk veils. It was about psychological domination, cultural annihilation, and the transformation of queens into shadows. And here lies the forbidden truth. These practices were not whispered merely because they were scandalous. They shocked even the standards of their own age. Christian Europe painted them as sins of the East. Ottoman chroniclers, meanwhile, recorded them in euphemisms, careful to veil the raw violence and desire that lay beneath. In this film, we will journey beyond the battlefield into the dark chambers of politics, intimacy, and survival. We will unravel the hidden power of desire as control, explore specific scandals that shaped empires, and step into the forbidden world where noble women were both prisoners and players. But be warned, this is not the history taught in classrooms. This is the silenced history of conquest, taboo, and the unspoken fate of noblewomen whose lives were sacrificed at the altar of empire. Power is never just measured in armies, fortresses, or crowns. In the Ottoman world, and in the empires they conquered, power often pulsed in the most intimate of chambers. Desire itself became a weapon, and the bodies of noblewomen were transformed into pawns of political theatre. For the sultans, taking a noblewoman of a fallen dynasty was not an act of lust alone. It was the symbolic erasure of a lineage. By claiming her, they claimed the empire she represented. The Byzantine princess became a concubine, the Hungarian countess a veiled shadow in the harem, the Serbian queen a consort stripped of title. It was a ritual of domination, a living reminder that every palace, every chapel, every throne had bowed before Ottoman might. The harem, often imagined in Western art as a playground of pleasure, was in truth a labyrinth of control. It was a prison gilded with silks, where women lived under the constant gaze of eunuchs and the shadow of the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. In this world, intimacy was currency, and survival depended on knowing when to obey, when to seduce, and when to remain silent. Sexuality itself was transformed into a political language. To the conquerors, noblewomen were not merely spoils of war, they were bargaining chips. A captive noblewoman could be gifted to a loyal general, married to an Ottoman governor to secure loyalty in a restive province, or kept in the Sultan's household as a living emblem of conquest. In every case, her body became the battleground where diplomacy and domination collided. But desire is a double-edged sword. What began as control could spiral into obsession. A sultan's infatuation with one woman could shift the balance of an empire. and history whispers of those who dared to use this desire as a weapon in return. Roxolana, later known as Hurrem Sultan, is perhaps the most famous. Once an enslaved concubine, she captivated Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent so completely that she rose above every noble-born captive and every rival. From a powerless girl of foreign blood, she ascended to the most powerful woman in the empire, reshaping Ottoman politics with a smile that concealed daggers. Yet for every Roxolana who turned captivity into command, there were countless others whose names never survived the silence. Their identities erased, their pasts obliterated. They became mere threads woven into the Sultan's tapestry of power. They were mothers of princes, yet denied the right to call themselves queens. They were wives in all but name, yet condemned to obscurity. This was the true psychology of Ottoman conquest, the ability to control not only land and armies, but the very bloodlines of the conquered. Through desire, intimacy, and forced unions, the empire reached into the most sacred part of human existence, identity itself. But what happened when this delicate balance of desire and control spiraled into scandal? When passion and politics collided, the result shook entire empires. The first great shock of such a scandal is about to unfold. The year was 1453, and the world was watching. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had withstood centuries of sieges, standing as the last remnant of the Roman world. But under the relentless siege of Sultan Mehmed II, the walls finally crumbled. The conquest of Constantinople was not just the fall of a city, it was the death of an empire. And within those walls, hidden away in palaces and convents, were the noblewomen of Byzantium. When the Ottoman soldiers poured through the streets, their fate was sealed. Chroniclers speak in half-silences and broken lines of poetry, for what they saw could scarcely be written. Noble daughters were torn from their chambers, widowed queens dragged into the light of defeat. They were not only the symbols of fallen dynasties, they were the living spoils that marked Mehmed's triumph. One name survives in the whispers of history: Anna Notaras, daughter of Lucas Notaras, the last Megas-Du, the Grand Admiral of Byzantium. After the conquest, she was reportedly offered to Mehmed II himself. In Venetian records, she emerges as a tragic figure, caught between survival and shame, her beauty and lineage transformed into bargaining chips in the Sultan's court. Other accounts tell of daughters of Byzantine aristocrats taken into the harem, their names erased, their futures repurposed for Ottoman power. Some were married to governors in distant provinces to cement loyalty, others vanished behind the palace gates, where the outside world would never see them again. The scandal of these fates rippled across Europe. Venetian diplomats spread stories of noblewomen violated in their chambers, of churches desecrated, of princesses reduced to slaves. Whether embellished or not, these tales became weapons of propaganda, fueling centuries of hatred toward the Ottomans. The image of the Turk as a barbarian conqueror, driven by lust as much as by war, was etched into Western imagination. But within the empire itself, the truth was no less scandalous. For Mehmed II, the conquest was not simply military glory, it was a chance to reshape dynasties. By taking noblewomen of Byzantium into his court, he erased their past identities, ensuring no rival claim to legitimacy could survive. Their wombs became vessels for Ottoman heirs. Their lineage dissolved into the empire that had crushed them. The human cost of this transformation is immeasurable. Imagine a woman born to the purple, raised within marble halls and golden mosaics, suddenly stripped of her titles, her faith, her very name. She became one among dozens in the harem, veiled, guarded, anonymous. Her survival depended on pleasing a ruler she had once prayed against in church. And yet, within this dark transformation lay the seeds of future power struggles. The harem would not remain a silent prison forever. From these forbidden chambers would emerge women who would wield influence in ways no one could have foreseen. But before that moment of power came scandal upon scandal. And as noble women became entangled in the politics of seduction and betrayal, the Ottoman court itself would tremble. Behind the towering walls of the Ottoman palace lay a world few men ever entered, the imperial harem. To outsiders, it was whispered about in tones of fascination and horror, a chamber of endless pleasure and unbridled desire. But the reality was far darker. The harem was a crucible of intrigue, where noblewomen, captives and slaves lived in a constant battle for survival. Here, intimacy was politics, and desire was the sharpest blade of all. The Sultan's affection was the most coveted treasure in the empire, for a favored concubine could rise above queens and princesses. A single night's passion could transform a nameless captive into the mother of a future sultan. But with such power came peril. Rivals schemed in shadows, whispering poison into the ears of eunuchs, bribing servants, plotting to undermine their competitors. A woman's beauty could bring her to the pinnacle of influence, but envy and betrayal could send her to an early grave. For noble-born captives, the stakes were even higher. Stripped of their former titles, they were forced to compete with women of humbler origins, who wielded cunning instead of lineage. Here, noble blood did not guarantee survival. In fact, it could mark them as threats, their very heritage a reminder of fallen thrones. The Sultan might favor a slave girl, who knew how to charm him over a princess who carried the weight of an empire on her shoulders. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, stood as the ultimate arbiter of this hidden world. She had once been a captive herself, perhaps a noblewoman, perhaps a slave, but now she ruled the harem with an iron hand. No woman rose without her blessing, and no intrigue succeeded without her knowledge. If the Sultan was the master of the empire, the Valide Sultan was the mistress of his heart, and through him, of politics itself. The most infamous example of this deadly dance was Hurrem Sultan, born Roxolana. Once a slave from the steppes, she outmaneuvered rivals of noble descent to become Suleiman the Magnificent's legal wife, a status almost unheard of in Ottoman tradition. Through seduction, intelligence, and ruthless cunning, she dismantled the influence of Suleiman's firstborn son and his mother, reshaping the empire in her image. Her rise marked the dawn of what historians later called the Sultanate of Women, an era when the empire's greatest decisions were shaped not on battlefields, but in the secretive chambers of the harem. Yet for every Roxolana who triumphed, countless noblewomen perished in obscurity. Some were poisoned by rivals, others were quietly strangled and cast into the Bosporus when they posed too great a threat. Even the favored lived in constant fear, for the Sultan's passion was fickle, and yesterday's beloved could become today's forgotten shadow. And so, the harem became both a gilded cage and a deadly arena. Seduction was a weapon, betrayal a necessity, and survival depended on mastering a game where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and the future of the empire itself. But what of the world outside the palace walls? How did the common people, peasants, merchants, and soldiers, see these forbidden practices? Their views reveal a chilling double standard, one that cut across every layer of society. Outside the gilded walls of Topkapi, life in the Ottoman Empire moved with its own rhythm. Markets bustled, prayers rose from minarets, and ships carried goods across the seas. But behind the veil of daily life, the fate of noblewomen after conquest sent ripples through society, shaping how ordinary people understood power, gender, and morality. For the elites, the absorption of noblewomen into the harem or their marriages to Ottoman officials was a spectacle of domination. Each union was a silent reminder of conquest. A Serbian princess married off to secure Belgrade, a Byzantine daughter given to a provincial governor to pacify rebellion. These women became living treaties, their wombs carrying the empire's peace. Among the common people, the stories of these fates were retold with fascination and fear. In taverns and village squares, peasants whispered of Christian princesses taken by the Sultan, their beauty both envied and pitied. For some, these tales confirmed the glory of Ottoman supremacy. Even queens now bowed before the crescent. For others, they were moral warnings, a grim reminder of what could happen when empires clashed. Daily life itself bore the imprint of these taboos. Ottoman men of rank could take multiple wives and concubines, their households growing into miniature courts of intrigue. Yet for women of common birth, chastity and obedience remained iron rules. A concubine's rise to power in the palace did not mean freedom for the baker's daughter or the shepherd's wife. The double standard was immense. What was celebrated as strategy in the harem was condemned as sin in the village. Religion added another layer of complexity. The forced conversion of noblewomen was seen as both a triumph and a necessity. To the Ottomans, it was purification, a way of ensuring loyalty by erasing a woman's former identity. A Greek noblewoman renamed with a Turkish title, or a Venetian lady veiled and given an Islamic name, symbolized the empire's ability to consume not just lands, but souls. For the conquered, however, these conversions were a source of grief, their daughters lost to a faith and culture they no longer recognized. And yet, despite the silks and jewels, daily life for these captives was far from idyllic. They were guarded constantly, their movements confined, their letters censored or forbidden. A woman of noble birth might sleep on velvet, but her life was still a cage. The harem was a prison of beauty, where a smile could mean survival and a misstep could lead to disappearance. The cultural impact stretched even further into art and imagination. European painters portrayed the harem as exotic, decadent, and sinful, while local storytellers shaped tales of women who either submitted to or defied their fate. In both East and West, the noblewoman of conquest became a symbol of forbidden desire and ultimate submission. But what happens when desire and domination stretch too far? When scandal and excess ignite rebellion? Or when one act within the palace shakes the empire to its foundations? History records such a turning point, and it would change everything. Every empire has a breaking point. For the Ottomans, the intoxicating mix of desire, intrigue, and conquest that once cemented their rule eventually became a source of weakness. The very practices that elevated noblewomen into pawns of empire began to destabilize the throne itself. Scandals erupted when the Sultan's passions overruled his political judgment. Courtiers whispered of rulers so entranced by a single woman that they neglected their armies, their provinces, even their laws. And when noblewomen, captives turned consorts, used their influence to secure favors for their own sons or allies, the delicate machinery of succession began to splinter. One infamous example came under Sultan Murad IV. Known for his iron will and brutal enforcement of discipline, Murad was also a man who feared the corrupting power of women within the palace. His reign followed decades of turmoil in which concubines and noble-born captives had wielded extraordinary influence. Scandals of poisoning, plots and favoritism had weakened the throne. Murad's answer was ruthless: executions within the palace walls. Women who schemed too openly were strangled with silken cords, their bodies quietly removed under cover of night. But the bloodshed did not stop the tide. The harem had already become a political battlefield, and the sultanate of women was in full swing. Noble women and captives, once silenced, had found ways to bend the empire's fate. Some used sons as pawns, manipulating succession struggles. Others played rival factions against one another. What began as whispers in the harem now reverberated through the corridors of power. The breaking point came when desire clashed with tradition. In the past, sultans avoided legal marriages, relying on concubines to prevent alliances that might empower foreign dynasties. But when Suleiman the Magnificent married Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, it shattered centuries of precedent. A former captive was elevated to legal wife, her children declared legitimate heirs. This singular act destabilized the empire's most sacred traditions, igniting jealousy, rebellion, and bloodshed among rival factions. For noblewomen of conquest, this was both a triumph and a curse. They could rise higher than ever before, but their elevation threatened the very stability of the empire. Every choice, every glance, every birth within the harem could now ignite civil war, and it was not only within the palace. In the provinces, subject peoples watched these scandals unfold with awe and fear. If a Serbian princess or a Byzantine lady could topple viziers and sway sultans, what did that mean for the order of society itself? Was the empire ruled by the sword, or by the whispered counsel of women behind a veil? This question haunted the Ottomans, and their answer was often violent. Stricter codes were imposed. Women suspected of plotting too much power vanished mysteriously. Yet the very need for such repression proved how far the taboo had gone. The noblewomen who had once been captives of conquest were now captives of their own influence, their rise triggering a backlash that would shape Ottoman politics for generations. And in that backlash lay the consequences, not only for women in the palace, but for the empire itself. What had begun as the unspoken fate of noblewomen would leave scars on history too deep to hide. The fate of noblewomen after conquest was not confined to gilded chambers or palace whispers. It reshaped the empire itself. What began as rituals of domination and assimilation grew into forces that altered dynasties, destabilized governments, and scarred entire civilizations. On the surface, The Ottoman method of absorbing noblewomen into the harem, or gifting them in political marriages, seemed like pragmatic statecraft. These women were used to pacify provinces, silence rivals, and bind former enemies into loyal subjects. But beneath the silks and ceremonies lay a festering instability. Each union created heirs whose legitimacy could be questioned. Each favored consort stirred jealousy among rivals, and each whisper of scandal eroded the perception of imperial strength. Dynastic chaos soon followed. The absence of a clear succession system meant that every son of a sultan could claim the throne, and with each prince came a mother, a noblewoman or concubine, fighting desperately for her child's survival. It was not uncommon for succession struggles to end in fratricide, with brothers slaughtering brothers, their mothers reduced to pawns in a blood-soaked game of survival. The wombs of noblewomen, once symbols of continuity, had become engines of violence. Beyond the palace, the consequences reverberated across cultures. In Europe, stories of noblewomen taken captive became fuel for propaganda. Pamphlets and sermons painted the Ottomans as a lust-driven tyranny, using the suffering of queens and princesses as rallying cries for crusades. These tales exaggerated, but their power lay in the grain of truth they carried. Even centuries later, Western art and literature continued to portray the harem as a den of sin, forever casting Ottoman power through the lens of sexual taboo. Within the empire, backlash took the form of reform. By the 17th century, sultans began limiting the political power of the harem, curtailing the influence of noble-born consorts and restoring stricter controls. Eunuchs gained even greater authority, ensuring that women remained secluded, their whispers reaching the sultan only through layers of gatekeepers. Yet the memory of scandals lingered, shaping how every future ruler approached intimacy and politics. The historical impact was not only political, but cultural. Archaeological records, Venetian spy reports, and Ottoman chronicles all hint at a duality. On one hand, noblewomen who became mothers of rulers, shaping laws and wars. On the other, countless unnamed women erased from memory, their identities dissolved in silence. Their absence in the historical record is itself a testament to how thoroughly their voices were suppressed. And yet traces remain. The rise of the Valide Sultan, the stories of women like Roxlana and Kosem Sultan, the venom of European propaganda, all point to a truth long hidden. The unspoken fate of noblewomen after conquest was not just about submission, but about transformation. It changed empires, toppled traditions, and left scars that history still struggles to confront. But what do these silenced fates mean for us today? In the shadows of modern scandals and political intrigues, echoes of these forbidden histories still resound. And the question remains, what secrets does power still hide behind its veils? The fate of noblewomen after Ottoman conquest is a story both silenced and unforgettable. They entered history as daughters of emperors, queens of kingdoms, and brides of noble houses, but their legacies were rewritten in the shadows of the harem. Some became mothers of sultans, whispering power into the ears of rulers. Others vanished, their names erased, their voices stolen. All carried the burden of conquest, not just on their bodies, but in their very identities. Across these stories, one theme emerges with chilling clarity. Power is never only fought with swords or cannons. It is waged in the quiet chambers of intimacy, in the coerced marriages, in the forced conversions, and in the silken prisons where noblewomen were bound. Empires rose and fell, not only on battlefields but in bedrooms, where desire was weaponized and bloodlines became tools of domination. The echoes of these taboos still haunt us today. Scandals of intimacy and power continue to topple leaders, destabilize nations, and inflame public outrage. From royal households to modern governments, the entanglement of desire, control, and politics remains as potent as it was in the age of empires. The Ottoman court's whispered intrigues mirror the secret affairs and forbidden scandals of our own world, proving that while centuries pass, human nature remains strikingly unchanged. What is most unsettling, however, is how thoroughly these women's voices were silenced. Their stories come to us through the pens of men, diplomats, priests, and court chroniclers, each with their own agendas. Rarely do we hear the women themselves. And that silence, that void in the record, forces us to ask, how much of history is built on the absence of women's words? What truths remain buried beneath veils, censored by power, erased by time? Their fate is a reminder that history is not just the story of battles and rulers. It is also the story of those who were conquered, silenced, and hidden. The noblewomen of Byzantium, Hungary, Serbia, and beyond did not vanish into myth. Their lives shaped dynasties, their wombs bore princes, and their struggles altered the trajectory of an empire. To ignore them is to ignore the very machinery of power itself. And so we close with a question, one that stretches beyond Ottoman palaces and ancient conquests. What other secrets lie buried in the shadows of history? What forbidden stories remain unspoken, waiting for us to unearth them? For as long as power exists, so too will its silences. And sometimes, it is in those silences, in the unspoken fates of the conquered, that the darkest truths are found. The unspoken fate of noblewomen after Ottoman conquests was not just their tragedy, it was the empire's, and its echoes still whisper to us today.